So we're intro. So have the fall colors started coming in over there yet?
Not quite yet. It's still quite warm. It's still comparatively the warm season here.
Okay.
Um, you'll know when you start seeing conkers that it's autumn.
Oh, I got you. Okay. We've got a little bit of it here, like higher up in the elevations. It's started to kind of peak out a little bit, but it's still very warm here too. So yeah. Oh, yeah. Let's see here.
Is there a way? Do you guys have a live chat? Is there a way I can view that?
There is, yes. Let me see here. I'm gonna drop it in the text chat we have. So if you can see podcast feed where you asked before,
Podcast feed.
yeah,
Yep.
that'll take you right to the
Okay.
YouTube channel where it's going live, and that'll show you the chat. And JC says, "Hi, Cybersmith."
Okay. I'll just open this up and I'll mute this
Okay.
so I can view. Hello, JC.
So I have to admit, we are a little like on this podcast. We're a little rough around the edges. I know you've done a few other podcasts before, and we're not. We've gotten the technical issues aspect out of the way. That used to be a running gag that we just couldn't get our cameras or audio right, but we at least have that down now. So
It happens. So podcast recording. And how do I go to viewing this?
so it
Uh,
should show you the.
there we go. Yep, here we go. And I've got the chat popped out.
Perfect.
Hello, JC. Okay, just
All right. Well, I'm gonna play the intro, and we're just gonna jump into it.
let's go.
Cool. Hello, everyone, and welcome to The Altar episode. What are we on now? Episode 151. Today we have a very special guest. The esteemed The Cybersmith is here to join us,
Me?
here to catch us up on what's going on in his world and what's been going on over the pond, as they say. And hopefully, maybe we'll be joined by Matt in a little bit if he can get his child army to bed, but they have been doing drills all day in preparation for the collapse, so we wish them well anyway. But, Mr. Cybersmith, how have you been, sir?
Life has had its ups and downs. My grandmother passed away quite recently.
Oh,
She
I'm
was
sorry to hear that.
she'd achieved quite a good old age. She was in her late 90s. So
That's yeah,
yeah,
that's very excellent. Yeah, that's a long life well lived, and
indeed.
yeah.
I don't think society is fully adjusted to the fact that people are living this long.
No, I really don't think it has because like after a certain point, there's really nothing for you to do, unfortunately, which is what people need when they get older.
We can
Is
keep
like
people alive. We can't quite keep them as functional as they'd like to be. And
exactly,
I
yeah.
think I think it, technology will hopefully catch up to that point. But uh, as it stands now, we're experiencing a bit of a problem that people are living longer, but they aren't functioning longer.
This
For
is true.
example, when things like retirement ages were set at 65,
Mhm.
most people were not expected to meet those. One of the major reasons that we have welfare states going bankrupt now is the reality that they were set up under the expectation that very few people would actually be drawing on pensions. Pensions were, in some sense, a type of insurance.
Mhm.
You were gambling against a probability of living past the pension age. Very few people were expected to. So this was, in the United States, you call it social security. Well, security is meant to protect you against something that you hope isn't going to happen.
This is true.
You don't want your house to be broken into. You have locks in case someone tries. It's not something you expect or plan for, but it's something you have a backup just in case. That was to some extent how old age provisions and old age financial resources reviewed. It was something the vast majority of people ideally would never use, but some people might live to that point, so let's have a provision in place in case they do. Now it's the expectation.
Mm.
Now the majority of people will live the majority of their lives over the age of 40. The majority of people are expected, if they've reached adulthood, certainly are expected to live well into their 80s, if not
Mm.
longer. And that does create pressure on these systems that were never intended to deal with it.
This is true.
So that is one of the issues that we have in our society. One of many.
So I guess on that real quick, what would your, what, maybe it wouldn't just be a one solution thing, but like, would you suggest, I don't know, possibly raising like the average age of retirement? Because
I think that's an absolute necessity. That is going to have to happen. But then we do need to deal with the reality that people are staying alive longer. They aren't necessarily staying healthy longer. They aren't
this is
staying
true.
mentally sharp and physically fit longer.
Mhm.
And we need to seriously look at medical technology that can extend not just the amount of time you stay alive, but the amount of time you stay physically and mentally
Mhm.
vibrant.
Okay. So, in other words, some sort of adaptive technology that allows them to, if they have, for I'd say the most common thing would be like physical impairments, like
Well,
most.
yes, I mean, my mother has both of her hips replaced. She's
Mm.
a true cyborg now. Two prosthetic hips.
Excellent.
So that's an example of the technology we need to be investing in more. Um,
So
but
the
I
way is
honestly,
in becoming essentially like humanity becoming cyborgs essentially is the way if we're going to keep
oh,
having.
absolutely. I think we need to get to the point where someone as old as my grandmother was realistically should have had most of her organs replaced with cybernetic implants several years ago. Um, by the end of her life, even when she was 90, she could drive, she could hold a full conversation. She was very, very active, very mentally sharp.
Mhm.
Um, I think her memory started going, and that frustrated her for a while. She eventually got to the point she couldn't drive. She needed quite a lot of help to live.
Mhm.
I think, have you played Deus Ex:
I have
Human
actually, yes.
Revolutions of
So,
Mankind Divided?
admittedly,
Something like the something like the InfoLink system that Adam Jensen had, that just kept a log of quests and constantly reminded him when he had a quest and how long he had to complete it and where he needed to go to complete it. If we just installed that on everyone once they hit the age of 80, I think that would go a long way to solving our problems
to be really
with
honest, I
with
think
the
we should
elderly.
maybe do that before people are 80. I feel like in my 30s, I feel like I could benefit from just like having a HUD in my vision all day.
Absolutely. I think that's, but at a certain point, I think it becomes more necessary for people. So I think
Hmm.
we should seriously look into installing those. And I believe Elon Musk has made some strides in that direction.
He has
So
actually, yeah, the
something
Neuralink.
akin to a Neuralink with a built-in Quest logger
Hmm.
that people could use to keep track of things. Well, what do I think of Canada's maid service? Well, they've been doing that in Canada for a long, long time. It used to be they'd push you out on an ice floe. Uh,
This is, yeah. Hmm. Hmm.
so they have. There was. It's actually a relatively small period of time in Canada when they didn't do that. Is there a mark on the wall, or is that a mark on? No, that's a mark on the screen.
Oh,
Sorry,
okay.
I was thinking, is there a mark on the wall? No, that's just something on the screen.
No, your wall is
Um.
totally fine.
Yes. Uh.
So yeah, you were
Well.
talking about Canada and the maid system, and they would either
Yes.
set you adrift, or if you were Native American, they would just drive you into the country during the winter and leave you out in the wilderness somewhere. So,
Yes, so they've adjusted their methods, but really that Canada is running into this problem that it simply doesn't have the resources to keep people alive,
hmm.
and yet it's got a large number of people who say, "No, I have the right to this. I have the right to this." But society doesn't have the means to provide it,
Hmm.
so their ideology is coming up against an economic roadblock.
This is
Um,
true.
so I think we do need to look into giving people augmentations along the lines of the Deus Ex games.
Okay.
Um, there may, to some extent, be a degree of government subsidization in it, but I think if instead of giving you some sort of old age pension, if we installed an info link in your brain um, but once you hit the retirement age, I
Mm.
think that would go a long way to solving our problems.
This is, yeah, that's actually one way you could do it. And also, if you think about it too, if the info link using your brain was operating with enough processing power, you could generate your own kind of cryptocurrency value by essentially just running the algorithms necessary to compute, like with Bitcoin, for
That
example.
only works up to a point. I think Bitcoin's got to be getting quite close to the point where there's nothing more to mine.
This is true, but I
Um,
mean, like, there's lots of alternative coins. I'm sure there will be something that becomes the next
there are,
thing.
but the other issue is when coins are at the point where they can be mined, they
Mm.
actually aren't very useful as currency.
Hmm.
They stop working as currency because they appreciate in value too quickly. They become a form
Mm.
of speculative financial investment.
Hmm.
Now, once that slows down, they start being treated as an actual currency. People use them to buy and sell things. They don't just hold on to them so that the value appreciates.
Hmm.
Trouble is, by that point, you can't use them to generate. The other issue is heat. It
Hmm.
produces a lot of heat to
That's
run those
true.
algorithms. If you've got something like that embedded in someone's brain,
Hmm.
how do you disperse the heat that's going to be generated from that? You do actually would risk the issue of brain damage
Hmm.
from that. If you've got these chips running very complicated algorithms repeatedly, but designed to be inefficient to run, but the only way they can run is if they are inefficient to crack. You are going to run into the issue of heat generation, and if that's running inside of your brain, you're going to run into the issue of brain damage.
Hmm.
You're
Okay.
going to cook the cells faster than the body can cool it down.
That makes sense. So you either have to really just limit the load that chip would be able to process, or you'd need some sort of heat sink that would like run along the outside.
And the
Okay.
trouble is, yeah, how do you install that inside of the brain? One possibility is dispersing some of the processing power to other parts of the body.
Hmm.
For example, replacing maybe one of the kidneys with a processor.
Hmm. Okay.
Um, But I think realistically, the issue is going to be you're going to have to make the code very efficient, run very
Hmm.
quickly.
Yeah.
Optimization will be a major part of this, as with anything that's running on an embedded system.
So
But that
Western
will
video
that will
game developers
preclude.
should.
That's going to preclude
Hmm.
any sort of. It's going to preclude any sort of cryptocurrency mining. You might
Okay.
well be able to access a cryptocurrency wallet mentally through some sort of Neuralink,
Okay.
but you probably won't be able to mine crypto coins.
Okay. That
Do you
makes more
mind
sense.
Diet Coke?
Oh no, go right ahead, sir.
Well, zero sugar, Coke Zero actually.
Okay.
But yes, so that is
Nice.
one potential issue that we're going to run into. And I think Canada is not a good solution to this, but it is a somewhat inescapable solution if you assume people have the right to be provided with these things, but the only way society can provide them is to just reclassify euthanasia as healthcare,
Mm-hmm.
because that's the only kind of healthcare that they can actually provide at scale. It's it's the mistaking of commodities for rights running into the issue of a society that does not have enough resources to provide them.
Okay, that would make sense. So before we get too far down this tangent, because this is honestly something I think we could dedicate an entire episode to. The real focus, what we want to talk about, is going what was going on recently in the UK. So I'm not gonna pull up any articles or show anything just because, like we discussed, there's a couple of things
Yeah.
that can't be shown literally. But I guess a lot of people have heard over here in the U.S. I've talked to a couple of my friends who live in like Russia and other people, some more people who live in Europe. They've heard various things. So there was an attack, I guess, at a Taylor Swift concert was one of the main things.
That's one of the things they've been, frankly, any given day, you can look up some new atrocious crime that would have
Really?
been unthinkable or major news a few decades ago.
Okay.
An old man stabbed to death. Um, you know, a machete attack at a bus stop.
Okay.
Attacks on soldiers. Attacks on retired pensioners.
Hmm.
Look it up. Rapes, stabbings, shootings, uh, clashes between violent crime gangs.
Okay. So,
syndicate wars. It gets to a scale where what would have been considered major news or even totally unthinkable a few decades ago is just commonplace. Um, and people become it's getting to the point where it's become a class issue
wow.
because
Okay.
the socioeconomically um, and this is something I think people underestimate this about the UK. We are a very wealthy economy.
Hmm.
We are not a wealthy population.
Hmm.
I'm relatively fortunate. My last few jobs have earned between 30,000 and 40,000 pounds per year. That
Hmm.
puts me very much in the now I haven't held those jobs for very long because of transportation issues and such,
Hmm.
but that puts me very, very firmly in the upper tier of UK income. Most people in this country earn much, much less. I think the average Briton, like outside of parts of London,
Hmm.
the average person in Britain is poorer than the average person in Mississippi.
Wow. Okay.
Um, you I think it's there's a left wing streamer who made the comparison. I think it was the pederast one, Vorsh, with the beard.
Yes,
Uh,
I'm glad you
he
specified
made
because the
yes,
pederast one could be almost any streamer these days, unfortunately. So,
the pederast one with the soy boy haircut.
oh
Uh,
yeah,
so
yeah.
so Vorsh, he made what is actually quite an accurate comparison. It's one that I think will help an American understand it.
Hmm.
The United Kingdom, in economic terms, is Mississippi if New York City was in it. Take
Hmm.
the capital city of Mississippi, replace it with New York City. That is economically where the UK is.
Wow.
The
Okay.
majority of people here are very poor by US standards.
Okay. All right.
Um, are very, very poor by US standards. So you've got a small group of people who can afford to not live here, to not live among the problems. You have a much larger population of people who can't afford to escape those. And those people have largely been working class people who, we have this political party called the Labour Party. And a large part of its base used to be these working class people of modest means.
Hmm.
Those people are now massively abandoning the Labour Party because they are having to live in these crime ridden areas. But the trouble is there's nowhere for them to go because there's no party that is really accepting this, except, well, there somewhat is. There's the Reform Party and the Conservative Party. Problem is the Conservative Party was in power for a long time and it promised that it would address these issues, but it hasn't.
Hmm.
The Reform Party is a relatively new party.
Hmm.
It's promised to address these issues, and so far it seems to be delivering on those promises. The trouble is, it doesn't have many seats. This is for a few reasons. One is that it doesn't have any major geographical concentration.
Hmm.
The other issue is that it's a relatively new party, so it's only really popped up in the past few years.
Hmm. That makes sense.
And our elections are, for all that people complain about, oh, democracy. The problem is the king isn't democratic. The House of Lords isn't democratic. The House of Commons is not democratic. We have the Labour government currently, as I mentioned, it's lost a massive amount of support. It's currently forming a majority government, which means it can pass bills that can't be vetoed, can't be
Hmm.
shut down. It can force them through the House of Commons, can force them through the House of Lords. So the only actual barrier to our Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, who's he's a thug, he's an absolute fascist.
Hmm.
Um, there was an incident a few years ago where he and his thugs just barged into this public alehouse, started manhandling the proprietor, shoving him around, and they just marched out on a whim.
Wow.
They're complete authoritarians. It's totally disgusting. Um, but they now they received a tiny percentage of the vote. I think about 80% of people didn't vote for them. They got, of the major parties, they got about 33% of the votes
Hmm.
of the major parties. You've also got to count people who voted for smaller groups and independents and so on. But they managed to achieve a majority of the seats
Hmm.
because the system is incredibly, incredibly undemocratic in that respect. But similar things are happening in France, in Germany.
Hmm.
You left wing governments that are clinging to power or have forced their way into power without very much support and have essentially decided if it's a choice between losing our radical communist homosexual, pronoun-laden, Illuminati, left-wing, red Chinese demonic agenda and losing democracy will throw democracy out of the window. And I'm not anti-democracy. I just think democracy has to exist in moderation.
Mm-hmm.
I believe there is a place for democracy. I believe there is a place for aristocracy. I believe those two should both exist in our society as moderating forces upon one another. The trouble is they're stripping out the aristocracy. They're trying to now remove hereditary peers from the House of Lords. They're stripping out the long-term thinking, aristocratic, low time preference aspects of governments. And then they're emphasizing their own bureaucratic managerialism, and they're saying, well, this is democracy, and it's important that the House of Commons have more power because it's democratic. But it's not democratic. The people who have total control over it received a minority of the votes.
Mm-hmm.
It's not at all democratic. It's horrendously undemocratic in many, many ways. It is an undemocratic system. I could spend an entire podcast I could spend an entire episode of your podcast going over all the ways in which it is undemocratic. And
Absolutely.
similar things happening in France, similar things happening in Germany, in Poland, in Greece, in many other countries. You are seeing this claim that we are ruling in the name of democracy. We are ruling, but we are ruling really with very little support, with very little public approval. And we are stripping away the older institutions because they are supposedly undemocratic. And what this essentially is it's the tyranny of managerialism. It's the tyranny of a small group of bureaucrats. This is really what's happened in Russia as well. If you look at Russia, that is the end result of this. They stripped out the old systems, the Tsar, the aristocrats, they're all gone. Then they had Lenin, and then Stalin, and then they had Beria, and then they had Khrushchev, and then they had the Pizza Hut guy.
They had
And
the Gorbachev. There was also Brezhnev.
yes,
Mm.
Gorbachev, the
The
birthmark fellow
birthmark.
from
Yeah.
the Pizza Hut adverts,
Exactly. Exactly. Yeah.
also from Chernobyl.
Yes.
But yes, so he's now gone. Now they've got Vladimir Putin, who is in some ways just a continuation of that. He was part of their security apparatus for a while, but they've taken total control. All of the old aristocratic systems have been stripped out. There's no czar. There are no aristocrats. That's all gone. And they rule in the name of democracy. But how democratic is it when Alexander Navalny is sent to prison and then dies in prison? How democratic is that? Not very
Exactly.
democratic, I think. So they're using the notion of democracy to install what is arguably not very democratic as a system. It has all the problems of democracy, none of the upsides of democracy, and it's emphasized to a far greater degree than democracy should be. Democracy should have safeguards, it should have limits put in. You shouldn't have absolute democracy for the same reason you shouldn't have absolute aristocracy or absolute tyranny. Both of those are unstable in their extremes. And that's a lesson that I thought we had learned in this country. We saw that the absolute extreme power of the sovereign monarch as embodied by Charles I was too far in one direction. But the absolute democracy and supremacy of Parliament, as embodied by Cromwell, was too far in the other direction. What you need is a sane, reasonable balance. And if you go too far in either direction, it breaks down. But we don't even get the upsides of going too far in the direction of democracy because our system doesn't even represent the common man. The common man is told that he's a far right fascist lunatic if he has any kind of problem with what's going on. He just has to shut up and deal with it. So our system has none of the upsides of going too far in the direction of democracy, but all of the downsides. And it's the same thing that's happening in Germany. It's the same thing that's happening wherever these Illuminati puppet organizations like the World Economic Forum have been able to exert their influence. Something similar, I think, is happening in Israel. You know, Netanyahu, tremendously unpopular. But
Somehow manages to maintain his power, though. Yeah, like
there's always a new crisis. There's always a new crisis. Now, I've got two different opinions on what will happen there. If he, one is that he'll do the decent thing. He'll take one for the team. He'll kill all of the people in Gaza. He'll kill all of them, and then he'll go on the run as an international fugitive and essentially act as a sin eater. He'll essentially be treated as the genocide. Oh yeah, there was a genocide, but it was Netanyahu, and he's gone now. The other possibility is that he won't kill all the Palestinians. He won't kill all of the people in Gaza and the West Bank. He'll kill just enough of them for the crisis to subside. But then in a few years, they'll rebuild their numbers. And another crisis. Guess you have to keep me in as the leader for another few years until I die.
Mm-hmm.
So he could do the decent thing, commit genocide, and go on the run from the United Nations as an international fugitive. Interpol would hunt him. He might get caught. He might not. By the time they catch him, he wouldn't live long enough to get trial. It would take years to go through all the proceedings. He'd die of old age by then. So he could do that. He could take one for the team, commit genocide, and go on the run.
That would be
Or
one
he
hell of a
could-
docuseries. Could you imagine how entertaining
Oh yeah,
that would be?
that's what I said. That's what I posted about that. It would be a really interesting basis for you could do a fictionalized version of it. It'd be really interesting.
Absolutely, yeah.
But what I think he may do, and maybe this is me being cynical, is he'll realize as long as there's a crisis, I get to stay in power. So what'll I do? I'll kill maybe a third, maybe 2/3 of the people in Gaza and in the West Bank. And then I'll let their numbers build back up. And there was another attack. Who could have predicted this? You'll have to vote for me. You don't like me, but you'll have to vote for me because you don't want to switch leaders during a crisis. So no one is ever incentivized to fix the crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And it's just down to incentive structures. That's really what it is. Part of it is that these people are evil, blood-sucking monsters who harvest adrenochrome from babies. But part of it is that the incentive structures encourage them to behave that way. Part of it is that we get the behavior we incentivize. You ask why in the USA, why are cars so big? Oh, the cars are so big because, it's toxic masculinity. Oh no, the cars are so big because we don't care about the environment. No, the reason the cars are so big, it's because Barack Hussein Obama, the Ba'athist socialist, he made rules that regulated smaller cars to the point of making them economically unfeasible.
This is true.
Cars are cheaper to build because of those regulations. It's incentives. You can't get away from the reality that incentive structures dictate social outcomes because they dictate, by and large, human behaviors. And when you have enough people, the occasional person who goes against the tide isn't enough. When you have a population of millions and millions of people, incentive structures dictate how your society will work. And the incentive structures are set up in a way that is very toxic, that is very harmful to society.
So would you say there is an incentive structure set up in the UK right now where, I mean, of course you could make the argument that these immigrants are incentivized to come to the UK because they're promised a better life, they're promised healthcare, they're promised housing.
Well, in many cases, they are wanted criminals in the countries they come from.
Yep.
So by coming here with no documentation, with no records, they're coming to a place where the police won't know their fingerprints. They're coming to a place where none of their gang affiliations will be recognized. They basically get to start over without a criminal record. It's the equivalent of starting a new game halfway through. I haven't played it, so I'm assuming this is how it works. If you get too high of a wanted level in something like, what's that game called? Grand Theft Auto?
Sure,
Imagine you
yeah.
just start a new game, but you port over all your money and all your guns and all your experience from the previous game.
Okay.
Imagine you could do that. Well, obviously you do it if you got too wanted.
True.
That's basically what they're doing. So that's a big part of the incentive structure.
Okay.
But why? So the question is, what's the incentive structure to allow them? Well, there's quite a few. For one thing, cheap labor. There's a lot of the people who are in Parliament are invested in companies that benefit a great deal from cheap labor. So by bringing across a surplus of labor, you depress the price of labor, which is economically good for them. So that's one incentive. Another is the potential for new voters. And this has been a problem in your situation as well. You made the argument that Ronald Reagan was in many ways a fantastic president, but now you're dealing with the reality that his amnesty bill allowed a bunch of people to stay, and
Mm-hmm.
their children can now vote, and they're now voting against Ronald Reagan's party.
Mm-hmm.
So if you plan in terms of decades ahead, then there's a massive political incentive as well to let these people in. And as I said, the people making these decisions, they are rich enough to avoid the immediate consequences.
Mm-hmm.
They're rich enough to live away from the stabbings
Mm-hmm.
and the machete gang fights
This is
and the
true.
rudeness.
Yeah.
They're
So, in response
yeah,
to that attack, and I guess everything else that has been going on, there were also a series of, I know there were protests, both people protesting the situation, and there were a lot of, it seemed like government organized protests that were like counter protesting those protesters. And there were multiple instances, I guess, of actual riots where there was damage done to property, and I guess Molotovs were thrown,
there
which.
were, and that's an unfortunate thing you'll see in
Mm,
any riots. We saw the same thing in 2011
mm,
in the riots that happened here. There, opportunists will just see it as an opportunity.
this is
They'll
true.
say,
This is true.
"Oh, bunch of people in the street.
Mm.
Now I can throw a brick through someone's window. Do I know what they're rioting about? Probably not.
Who
Do I
cares?
care?
I just want to
Definitely not.
break
I
stuff.
want to throw a brick through a window."
Exactly.
And
Yeah.
it's unfortunate
Mm,
that that happens. But yeah, that's human nature for you.
this is true.
So that's part of what happens. But I think
Mm,
it's also that happening in the context of this recent election.
okay.
It's
Yeah.
the fact that we have since about the late 90s, the British people have consistently not voted for parties that said they were going to increase immigration.
Mm,
Parties either didn't say they were going to increase immigration or they said they were going to reduce immigration.
mm.
We have consistently never voted for someone who said more immigration, and yet we've consistently gotten more immigration. It's
Interesting.
why people are so cross with the Conservatives. It's why,
Mm,
despite Labour losing all those votes didn't go to the Conservatives
mm,
because people lost support for the Conservatives. The
mm,
Conservatives had a long, long run of political power in this country.
mm,
Why did they have that long run? Because they said they were going to reduce immigration, but they didn't reduce immigration.
mm,
The British people have said we don't want more immigration because our roads can't keep up with it, our infrastructure can't keep up with it,
mm,
our social services can't keep up with it.
mm,
We can't keep up with the rate of people coming in. And of course, some of these people are going to be elderly or are going to have children, and they haven't spent their lives paying into the social safety net like we have,
mm,
but they're going to immediately start taking out of it. It's not economically sustainable. We want it to stop. And
mm,
then you've got the crime. And then you've got the cultural incompatibility.
mm.
And then you've got the fact that many of these people don't interact with the economy the same way native Britons do.
True.
For example, a lot of them are Muslims. And what
Mm.
can't Muslims do? Muslims can't,
Eat pork. Drink
well, there's that.
alcohol.
Drink alcohol. What's a major part of the British economy?
Beer.
Pubs.
Ups. Okay. Pubs. Yes.
Pubs. So you've now got a whole new group of people who, even if they do start earning a wage, even if they do start interacting with the economy,
Mm,
they aren't patronizing the traditional aspects of the economy. And
mm,
you now have problems that, well, people are saying pubs are having problems because even though we have new people, they are people who don't interact with the economy the
mm,
way British people traditionally have.
mm, mm,
So that is one issue. That is
mm,
one part of it. And people just got cross because it
mm,
seemed that the system was not listening to their concerns.
mm,
They got very, very angry because they were living under a system that
mm,
did not seem to respond to them.
mm.
And I think Charles III may have to invoke his royal powers, get rid of Keir Starmer, call for fresh elections, and I think we may have to roll back the parliamentary system to 1831.
Oh, okay.
I think it may be time to remove the franchise from women, from men who don't own land, which
Mm,
includes me, by the way.
okay.
I wouldn't be able to vote under the 1831 rules.
Fair enough. Fair enough.
Um,
Okay.
and I think it may be time to enact those reforms because the system at least worked back then. That was at least a viable system.
This
I
is
think
true.
our
You
modern
you got
system just
shit done
doesn't.
back in the day. Yeah. But one
Indeed.
one thing I did want to touch on real quick because I've had a number of people actually ask me this. So, do you feel like everything that has happened recently, the protests, the riots, all of that, do you feel like this is actually indicative of a shift in culture or a shift in society? Or do you
Yes,
feel like, okay, so
I
you
think
do.
I think the thing that has shifted in society is people have lost faith in traditional institutions.
I would agree. I would agree that's a global phenomenon, but like, I guess it's
Absolutely.
a good
As I
thing
said,
to see it boiling up, I guess, over there.
yes,
And yeah,
this mirrors what has happened in France. This mirrors what has
mm,
happened in Germany and in Greece.
this
And
is
in
true.
your own country, this has happened to some extent. And you are now facing the reality that um, Hillary Clinton challenged the election results in 2016.
Mm,
Donald Trump challenged the election results in 2020.
mm.
I don't know who's going to win the 2024 election. I do know that someone is going to challenge the results.
That's very true. It seems like
The people in your country do not accept the system as valid anymore.
I have
People are
noticed
losing
that,
faith
like,
in these
every
institutions.
major election, either a presidential election or a midterm election, if one party loses big or just simply doesn't win in the way they want, the immediate reaction is just, oh, it was hacked, it was rigged, there was padded votes, they had illegal mail-in ballots, what have you. People have lost faith completely in the democratic system now. As an anarchist, I'm okay with this because I'm also partially an accelerationist in that regard. So the more people who are disenfranchised with voting to me is a good thing. Now, we might not agree on that, but if you look at what we have to choose from this election, which I wanted to actually ask your opinion who you think might win. But first, what I want to cover is like what we originally had first were two very old gentlemen. One was just under the age of 80, the other one was just over the age of
Yes.
80.
And then one of them revealed that not only did his brain not work, it probably hadn't been working for at least months, maybe years,
Yeah,
which
yeah.
raises the question, what happens if Russia invades Alaska tomorrow? What happens if the Red Chinese try to launch an assault on Hawaii?
Or Taiwan.
What hap- Indeed, what happens if the North Koreans, um, let's say the North Koreans send an amphibious assault force to California
Hmm.
and they kidnap um what's that guy, Gavin Newsom? Is it Gavin Newsom, the
The
guy who got in
governor of
California?
California? Yeah.
Yeah. Let's say they kidnap Gavin Newsom and they threaten to execute him on live television unless the USA bans the circulation of that uh, James Franco and Seth Rogen film, The Interview.
Oh, okay.
Who is going to make the decision of how to respond to that? Because Joe Biden doesn't seem mentally capable of making a response to this.
This is true. This is very true. I would personally hope it would be me who gets to make that decision because I would say, have at it. Do whatever you need to do with the man. Nobody actually likes him. However, that does raise an interesting question. Who the hell is running our country right now? If Joe
Yes,
Biden is not mentally capable enough to run for president, how is he mentally capable enough to continue serving his term as president? And also, one major thing is like Kamala Harris knew the entire time the state Joe Biden was in.
yes,
Everybody knew. 3 months ago, everybody was still selling the Joe Biden is sharp as a tack. He's really witty and he's gonna wipe the stage with Trump. And
exactly.
it was embarrassing. It was honestly
So
kind of sad.
here's the other question.
Hmm.
If Joe Biden has not functionally been president for, let's say, at least, let's be generous,
Mm-hmm.
let's say that his brain shut down the day before the debate.
Mm-hmm.
Well, he hasn't been removed as president. He is still at least nominally president. He is still at least nominally exercising presidential power, though you know he really isn't. So, in what sense does this reflect democracy? Does this
Exactly.
reflect the view of the Electoral College? Of course, people are challenging the election. The
Mm-hmm.
election can't possibly be valid because whether you think Donald Trump won it or Joe Biden won it, Kamala Harris was not elected as president in that election,
She
and
wasn't
yet she
even.
seems to be serving as president.
Yeah.
And that's the best case scenario. The best case scenario is Kamala Harris because that's the least illegitimate answer. The least
Exactly.
illegitimate answer is that the person on the vice presidential ticket is running it. But we don't know who's actually making the decisions.
Mm-hmm.
All the cabinet members, they're not taking their orders from Joe Biden. So what are
Mm-hmm.
they doing?
Mm-hmm.
Are they perhaps donning black robes, retreating to some mysterious altar in the woods, cutting their thumbs and kneeling before a giant stone carving and praying to some eldritch creature from beyond the stars? Is
Mm-hmm.
that who's giving instructions? Are
Mm-hmm.
they maybe calling out to beings from outside of what we would consider material reality,
Mm.
where are their instructions coming from? The least illegitimate answer is Kamala Harris. The best case scenario is that the person that you thought had been elected as vice president had effectively been elected as president. That
Mm.
is the least illegitimate answer. It's not even clear that the people actually running the country are even from this plane of the universe.
This is
They may
very
be
true.
along a dimensional axis that we can't normally perceive. And there are some
Mm.
theories that the universe is 9 dimensional or even 11 dimensional,
Hmm.
but we can't normally perceive more than 3 spatial dimensions and 1 temporal dimension.
Mm.
But there may be axes of motion beyond that. And it's possible that along one or more of these axes of motion, you have entities that are sapient and intelligent, but unlike us.
Mm.
There are thoughts that the Haitians during the Haitian Revolution may have communed with these entities in a dark ritual called Boys Cayman.
Mm.
Um, is that who's running the country? No one seems to know.
Mm. That would be interesting because that would actually make a connection back to Hillary and Bill Clinton, who, let's be real, stole a bunch of money from Haiti and fucked that country up royally when it
And
needed
killed
some,
Vince Foster
and killed Vince Foster over the affair, of
and
course.
raped Monica Lewinsky.
Yes, exactly, exactly. So who knows how that's connected?
Indeed. So these questions are raised, and it's not surprising that people have lost faith
Mm.
in your electoral system. Someone just mentioned the Nephilim. That's actually an
Mm.
excellent point. I remember discussing that earlier today. It's now quite widely believed, and there is some amount of evidence to suggest that part of the reason for the war in Iraq in the
Yep,
early
yep.
2000s
Mm.
was that Saddam Hussein was researching um, these Nephilim beings that
Mm.
were of partially unearthly
Mm.
descent. And the descendants of these beings, and according to some accounts, even unearthly beings themselves, watcher
Mm.
angels, were still present in
Mm.
Iraq at that time. There were freedom of information requests made about these. It's all quite heavily suppressed,
I
but
remember this
supposedly that is
specific.
part of the reason
Yeah,
for the invasion of Iraq. It was an attempt to seize control of Saddam Hussein's research
if I'm
into the
remembering
Nephilim.
correctly, there was specifically also something about there were emails, I think, from Hillary Clinton's server that got leaked by WikiLeaks that dealt with
Indeed.
that, and specifically they were looking for the tomb of Nebuchadnezzar that they believed was in Iraq, and they believed, I think, that Nebuchadnezzar was like a Nephilim or something like that.
He was a partially unearthly descent, and it's
Exactly.
not it's not impossible. Even up to the early Middle Ages, there are accounts of royal figures who were partially non-human. The very first king of France was called Merovech, and Merovech's father, according to some accounts, was actually an antediluvian sea creature called a quinatar. That's Quinotaur,
Hmm.
a very mysterious sea creature. So he was not of entirely human descent. The French royal family is, including Charlemagne,
Hmm.
is very distantly related to the Quinatar.
Hmm.
So it is not unheard of. Many of the I believe the Japanese royal family can trace its descent back to a solar being, Amaterasu, I think his name was, a being who was partially composed of plasma,
Hmm.
a solar entity.
Interesting.
So that I think it's very plausible that they were trying to seize control of that.
That would make sense. Yeah. So, okay, let's rein ourselves back. This has been a very interesting podcast. We've covered a lot of topics. We definitely covered the main stuff, I think. So I guess yeah, that was the question. We're kind of rolling back to that a little bit. Is like you do believe this isn't something that like in a year this is just another event that's going to get memory hold in a long chain of things where
I
nothing ever
don't think. Well,
happens.
the specific event may get memory hold,
Mm-hmm.
but what won't get memory hold is the sense that our institutions are no longer legitimate,
Okay.
the
Okay.
sense that our institutions no longer represent us.
Hmm. Well,
That's not going away. Um,
I agree. If not, I certainly hope that is the case because it's the complacency I think that is really the issue. Is just like the amount of people who, in some regards, are able to look at like either children getting murdered or people getting murdered in general, or the rapes and the assaults and the thefts and the robbery and just the changing of like
no one seems to wear a hat anymore. If you look
exactly.
outside,
Yeah.
if you look back 80, 100 years, everybody wore a hat outside. It was considered a normal part of of just not even formal wear. You wore a hat to go to the shops and buy cabbages.
Hmm.
You wanted to buy a head of lettuce. You put on your hat to go. No one seems to do that anymore.
Exactly. Because of
There
woke.
has been a degradation. Exactly. There's been a degradation in public morality because of woke.
Hmm. Exactly. Yeah. But I guess that
And
is
people may not be able to name it or exactly explain it, but they feel it. They are
true.
aware of it.
I would say like in day to day, it does kind of seem like I'm gonna try to make this relate as best I can. People do seem to be more irritable lately in general in public, I think, and I think a lot of that has to do with the fact that people are just carrying the weight all the time of that loss of faith in their institutions and that loss of faith in just
Indeed,
yeah,
people feel that they are in a hostile society.
exactly, yeah.
They feel that they are, in some sense, under siege,
Hmm.
and in some sense, they are. They are under the siege of wokeism.
This is true, yeah. So we've got, I would say, about a good 15 minutes left in this podcast. Is there anything specifically you wanted to cover, either about like what's been going on in the UK, or is there just another topic in general that you just
What
really
are
you?
your thoughts on? So this is an interesting one.
Mhm.
What are your thoughts on the assassination attempt against Donald Trump by the Illuminati, and the revelation that the Secret Service agents who were supposed to be protecting him had, at the very least, neglected their duties? What
I
do you think the long-term implications of that are going to be?
So one thing I can definitely say is that I have a long memory of like stories about the Secret Service having issues. It's not actually a
They
new
were
thing.
originally, I believe, set up in your country to track forgers and counterfeiters,
Correct,
protect
yeah.
the mints.
The-
They were then assigned the duties of presidential protection.
mm.
Is this maybe them saying, we don't want to do this anymore? We'd like to go back to going after forgers, and they're, what's it called, quiet quitting, when you do the bare minimum,
Mhm.
and they're essentially saying, we don't want this to be our job anymore. We're tired of being presidential protection. We want to focus on dealing with counterfeiters. We want to go back with that. We're going to do as bad of a job as possible. So you take this responsibility away from us. Is that what's happening here?
That's very possible, or I honestly think what it is, it's just like, for the most part, all of these very highly trained and therefore like highly wound up individuals are always constantly in this environment where like nothing really happens. You have minor security issues at certain events. Some dude gets caught on the security perimeter with a handgun, or like some dude's got a knife, or there's like some fist fight in the parking lot or something like that. But like ultimately, you're like a highly trained attack dog that never gets set off of its leash. So when it finally happens, you don't actually perform the way you're supposed to because adrenaline is pumping through your veins and you should be training more, but you don't really train as much as you should.
There is that, but there's also the fact that the people surrounding Donald Trump, he's a big man. He's a
This
big,
is true.
broad-shouldered,
He
tall
is a
man. A lot of
yeah.
the people surrounding him, they were literally too short to shield him. And also, why are they wearing business suits? These people should be wearing full suits of plate armor.
So the reason they wear business suits is because they attempt to blend in. Like obviously, you see a dude
But that's
dressed
the
like
thing.
the Men
Most
in Black.
Americans don't wear business suits anymore. That would allow them to blend in if it was still the 1920s. But the average American now wears a t. The average American now dresses like that ogre you've got, John Fetterman.
Oh geez, yeah. So the Secret Service should be wearing like hoodies and like Adidas track pants and like
Yeah,
just
they'd
tennis
look like the
sneakers.
average American.
Actually, yeah, you know what? Yeah, let's do that. Let's just like everybody's got like an
Or they should actually
MP7 in a
wear
little
properly
pouch.
protective. Or they should wear properly protective clothing. They should wear full suits of plate. They should wear full plate and mail harnesses.
Okay, I got you. So like a royal guard, in other words, like the Swiss guard that defend the Pope or something
Yes.
like that.
Hmm.
Okay.
Or even if they're going for a more even if they want something that's slightly more mobile, that's less cumbersome, less exhausting if they have to move around on a very hot day, even something like a helm and cuirass like the household cavalry wear would be
Hmm.
reasonable.
Okay. Okay.
But
That's a thought.
in practice, you've got these unarmored people who are smaller than the person they're going to protect. What are they going to do? You could dive in front these they've got these tiny little women who could dive in front of Donald Trump and
Hmm.
not really do anything to block him out. It's not like you don't have big people in America.
Hmm.
You've got plenty of people who are very, very big. Like you I'm not even saying this is necessarily a sex or gender thing. I'm sure there's big flabby 6'3" women in America who could stand in front of Donald Trump and completely occlude him.
This is true.
Goodness knows I see enough of them on pornography sites.
They don't even
You
need
could
to.
you could stand those people in front of Donald Trump if that's a goal. But instead, they defended him with people who were physically too small
I
to
just had
actually
an
exclude
idea.
him.
This would A, make a callback to Gaddafi. B, so the WNBA complains all the time that its top athletes don't get the attention that they feel they should get. What if the top like 20 athletes in the WNBA also doubled as the US president's like secret like super tall women's security team for the Secret
Excellent.
Service?
You can do that, and that allows the Secret Service to go back to its original job of protecting the U.S. currency.
There we go.
Everybody wins, but they don't do that. Well, who runs the Secret Service? Currently, it's whoever's running the US government, the US executive branch,
Mm-hmm.
which is nominally Joe Biden. In practice, best case scenario, that's Kamala Harris.
Mm.
Worst case scenario, that's an otherworldly intelligence that speaks to them in their dreams when they sacrifice children and drink the adrenochrome of babies.
So on that real quick, what I wanted to add is like I actually what think the situation is Joe Biden is really actually probably being piloted by his wife, Jill Biden, because that's something that
That
we
is a thought.
saw with
People thought
Reagan.
Reagan,
Yeah,
yes, in
Nancy
the very
Reagan.
last years of his life.
And like I don't know if he had a wife who was doing the same thing, but I imagine there probably was some individual who was piloting Brezhnev, for example, at the time when he was running the USSR. But it'd be easiest, I think, like outside of Kamala, would be Jill Biden because I mean, on the one hand, she is a doctor. Like, I don't think it's an actual medical degree, but like it's a doctorate in something. So you know,
And there's
but
the other question. Do you remember that weekend where he initially said at the start of the weekend, I'm not dropping out, I'm going to keep running.
mm,
Then you didn't hear from him for days.
yep,
And a screenshot was posted of a
of his
document,
yep,
saying actually Kamala Harris is taking over.
yeah, and it was supposedly like auto pen, yeah.
I think they basically cut him off from communication. And it may not even have been Kamala Harris who uploaded that. Anyone with access to Joe Biden's Twitter account could do that.
It was some
Anyone who guessed
23-year
his
old.
password. It could have been someone who guessed his password, could have done that.
Mm-hmm.
He was incommunicado for a while.
Mm-hmm.
And they basically said, look, this is what's happened while you've been away. You can admit that we've done this to you, which completely delegitimizes you, completely delegitimizes Kamala Harris, guarantees you'll lose the election,
Mm-hmm.
ruins your legacy, or you can go along with it.
Mm-hmm.
Now, does that sound like democracy to you?
Well, that's what we
Does
have to
that sound
do.
like what your founding fathers intended?
But that's what we have to do to
Is that
protect
why you
democracy. You don't understand. We have to break
is that why
democracy in
you
order to save it.
betrayed your is that why you betrayed your rightful king, George III? Is that why you turned traitor?
Hold on.
What was it all for? What
Oh,
was it? What did you throw that tea in the fucking water for? For this?
everyone, listen. He's got
What
a
were those
point. He's got a
caffeinated
point.
fish for? What was the benefit of all of it? For this? Are you happy, Yankees? Is this the democracy you valued so much?
Oh,
No
man.
taxation without representation. Do you feel represented now, Yankees?
Wig, sir, I have nothing to say. You have demonstrated that point. Yeah. What is it all for? Like considering what we did back in the day over what we did it over a 3% tax compared to what we are dealing with right now, it is embarrassing that we just sit and take this. And there are all of these people who constantly talk about, the tree of liberty needs to be refreshed from time to time with the blood of patriots and tyrants. And what we saw with January 6th, honestly, is that like people really expect to be able to storm the Capitol building and then go home for dinner and just like expect nothing to
Those
happen.
people weren't even trying to. That was just a protest. That
It was
was
a protest.
legitimately just a protest.
Exactly.
That wasn't a coup attempt. They were trying to make themselves heard, and
True.
they perhaps naively said, "Okay, these are the people who we want to bring our concerns to. So let's actually go to where those people are."
Oh no! See, here's the thing.
It was arguably naive, but that's
Yeah.
a protest. That's
No,
not a
for
coup.
sure. Oh,
This isn't
definitely
like
was not a
For
coup.
Honor, where you occupy a command point for a certain amount of time and you win.
Exactly.
They were trying to make their voices heard. Now, they
Yes.
weren't especially polite about it,
Mhm.
but that is a protest. That's not a coup.
This is true. But no, well, what I was saying essentially is like, whether it definitely was a protest. Like, I'm not saying it was a coup at all. It definitely was not. However, they stormed the Capitol building of the federal government. Now, whether or not you believe it's a valid protest or not, some people do. I think it was. Some people don't.
That's public property.
Exactly. But
do you say they stormed it? Don't their taxes pay for it? Isn't that their house? Is that not the people's house?
Very good point.
Is it really storming? Can you storm public property when you are nominally a citizen of the country that property is public to?
So
that's at most misuse of public property. That's not storming.
Okay.
If they had stormed the Canadian capital, maybe.
Different
if they'd
story.
gone down to Mexico and attacked the capital in Mexico, that could be storming. But they are citizens of the USA. That is the USA. That is the capital. That is misuse of public property. Maybe it's not storming it.
Okay. However, we still have people who want to enact massive events that enact big change like this. Let's say they're fine. They're grossly misusing the Capitol building, but they entered the Capitol building with the intent to force their voices being heard. Now,
yes.
Eventually, when you push hard enough on this, you cross a line where you can't just go home at the end of the day and have dinner normally. Arguably, maybe you should. That's the thing. Arguably, maybe you should be able to.
Most of the people remember. There's a previous case where this happened. The Malheur County Resource Center with the Bundy Ranch.
This is true.
They mostly got to go home at the end of the day, apart from one person who the police, I think, very unfairly and very recklessly shot dead. Most of those people did go home. You can just go home, and you've also got to think this was what 2020 2021.
Yeah.
So this is not that long after there were the BLM riots.
This is
true. A lot of people attacked. Now, here's where I think I will probably upset some of the more traditional conservatives. I actually don't mind if they attacked. If they think they had a legitimate point, I sympathise with them attacking police stations. I draw the line at attacking private businesses and private homes. But if you think the police are acting improperly, attacking a police, then the question is just, have we reached the threshold where you can attack a police station? Attacking a police station is eventually valid.
Yes.
We agree there is a point of police misconduct at which it would become valid. The only question is, had that point been reached?
Fair enough.
But those people, by and large, went home and got on with their lives.
This is
the
true.
People who are protesting for Palestine right now, the people who are protesting, in many cases, they're echoing Hamas propaganda and waving Hamas flags, and they are adherents of Hamas and Palestine ideology. They get to go home at the end of the day and eat their dinners. Why shouldn't the people from January 6th go home and eat their dinners? They, perhaps rudely, perhaps improperly, perhaps in a way that showed a lack of propriety, but an understandable lack, I think, an understandable lack of propriety. They tried to make themselves heard. I think they should get to go home and eat their dinners.
I would definitely agree.
At the very most, they are guilty of someone who swear. Let's say your house is on fire and someone says, "Oh, bugger! Oh, bloody hell, the house is on fire." That's rude. He shouldn't say it like that, but he's not wrong.
This is true. No, I agree. They should be able to go home at the end of the day because there is a double standard in place where certain protesters are allowed to do whatever they want and other protesters are
Well,
not.
you saw the same thing here in the UK.
Mm-hmm.
We've had massive issues of people blocking the streets for environmental causes or political
Same.
causes relating to conflicts in faraway countries
Mm-hmm.
halfway across the world.
Mm-hmm.
Those people are not receiving lengthy prison sentences. Those people are not being debanked. They are not being demonized by Keir Starmer.
Mm-hmm.
Violent criminals are not being let out of prison to make room for those people.
Mm-hmm.
They are
So
allowed
true.
to go home and eat their dinners.
Mm-hmm. I guess maybe the point I was trying to make about being going home and eating dinner is like eventually there is going to come a point in time where we've reached the threshold where you have to push back so hard. It's one of those things where you don't want to invoke the term civil war or anything close to that because it's a truly terrible thing. But
Well, most civil wars aren't called civil wars unless it's in hindsight. Look at the war between the states in your own country.
Mhm,
That was only that wasn't called a civil war at the time. The people fighting from one side were calling it a war of secession. The
mhm,
people on the other side were just calling it an insurrection. This
mhm,
is an armed rebellion. We are putting down a group of armed criminals.
mhm,
The other side, we are fighting for independence against tyranny.
mhm.
No one was calling it a civil war at the time.
This is true.
It wasn't called civil war at the time.
But there
Most
was
people considered it a war of independence,
mhm,
or they considered it essentially extraordinary police action against a group of criminals.
yes, but
Civil wars are really only ever called civil war in hindsight.
mhm. There was a point in time though during that period of time where it went from people arguing about theoretically about what we should do. We should do this. We shouldn't do that. We should have the government set up this way. We should have slavery. We shouldn't have slavery. Then it was no longer a discussion. Then there were men killing each other in a field somewhere. It changed. It was no longer you have a nasty debate or you have a
But it didn't really
protest.
happen
It
overnight.
didn't
So,
happen
for
overnight,
example,
no.
there was burning Kansas.
Mm-hmm.
There was the what was there was the Harper's Ferry raid.
Mm-hmm.
There were various, long before either Jefferson Davis or Abraham Lincoln actually took office,
Mm-hmm.
there were escalating conflicts,
Mm-hmm.
but no one called it civil war except in hindsight. I think maybe there were one or two people. I believe there was one person who said, "You have chosen to inaugurate civil war," but he said that as a reproachment to Lincoln.
Mm-hmm.
It was never something. No one was saying, "Let's have a civil war."
Yeah, or now we have
No,
become civil war. Like, yeah, no, it
yes.
didn't happen.
What are we? Some sort of civil war?
Oh,
No one, no one at the time thinks let's have a civil war.
mm-hmm.
Civil wars are things that you look back on and declare in hindsight.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and they are generally they are failures to compromise, or they are the point at which compromise becomes impossible. And I think they are the result of centralizing too much power.
Mm-hmm.
People won't accept losing an election beyond a certain point of authoritarianism.
Mm-hmm.
When the government has control over relatively small amounts of stuff, you are willing to lose an election.
Mm-hmm.
You are willing to say, okay, I guess you guys get to set the tax rates, and you guys get to decide what color the buses are, and you guys get to decide which roads we'll build in which order. And then in 4 years' time, or 5 years' time, or 6 years' time, we'll have an election, and maybe it'll be our turn.
Mm-hmm.
If they decide how your children will be educated, if they decide every aspect of your financial life, the taxes that you'll pay to your employer, the taxes you'll pay when you buy things at a shop, if they decide what you're allowed to say, what you're allowed to wear, where you're allowed to live, at a certain point, people will no longer accept the possibility of losing an election. And this is why I say societies can't be both democratic and authoritarian beyond a certain point. You can't have that, because at a certain point, people will not accept losing an election. They won't accept 51%. Now, of course, 51% doesn't even decide it. Like, I'm criticizing the abstract idea of democracy, but I want to make it clear that's not what we have. Our election isn't being decided by 51%. Labour runs the country, but they got a fraction of that. They got less than a third of the
Mm-hmm.
votes. Well, less than a third of the country voted for them. Um, so it's not even the 51%. But even if you did have that, people will not accept being told what to do in every aspect of their lives by a slim majority. You will just reach a point where the government can't be authoritarian and democratic. Anyway, this is about where we wanted to go. So I'll plug my X account.
Hmm.
I underscore am underscore cybersmith. I'll plug my Tumblr, the underscore cybersmith, and I'll plug my YouTube, cybersmith videos. Look me up on there. It was great talking to you, Based
Indeed, it
Heisenberg. I'm
was.
sorry Moonlit, Matt, and Yimra weren't able to attend. Do you have any final questions?
No, I have nothing. I think we covered everything we wanted to, and I wanted
I
to end
was
with
I was glad to.
yes, thank you very much for joining us. This is, as always, like whenever you're on, you are very, I gotta say, you're very well spoken. You present your points very eloquently. Like,
My pleasure.
I'm sure we'll
And
have
it's
lots of people who will want to continue
great
the
to have,
argument,
and
but
there are plenty of things I disagree with you about, but
mm,
it's great to be able to have that conversation.
of
Have a
course,
lovely time.
you too. All right, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us. And the Cybersmith, you may not agree with this, but as always, here on the altar, we believe taxation is theft.